I'm Cindy Wooden. I'm the Rome Bureau Chief for Catholic News Service, which is the news agency of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. I have this press pass, which is my license to ask questions, and is pretty much the only thing I'm qualified to do, especially in this gathering. So what we've agreed to, I hope, is that I will ask questions and our esteemed panelists will respond and hopefully kind of get into some interesting points, and then we'll open it up for all of you to ask your questions, make your comments, share some of your experiences. So first, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have Ms. Carol Batchelor, who is the Director of the Division of International Protections for the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. We have Michele Klein Solomon, who is the Director of the Global Compact for Migration at the International Organization for Migration, which is the UN Migration Agency. And then we have Mr. Walter Brill, who is the Director of Operations for the International Catholic Migration Commission. And the thing that impresses me most about them, I think, is that they have experience in direct work with people on the move. They have experience in the development of policy, and they have experience in at least the attempt of implementing those policies. So I think they have some vast amount of experience that they can share with us, as well as some kind of more reflective thoughts about the work that all of you are engaged in and all of them are engaged in. So first I'd like to start with Ms. Batchelor and ask, kind of in general, from your agency's perspective, what are the most difficult and pressing issues at this moment?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today. And I was greatly inspired by the opening messages. What are some of the most difficult challenges as far as the UN Refugee Agency is concerned? You might expect me to say numbers. We have over 66 million people of concern to UNHCR today. That means refugees, stateless persons, internally displaced people. And this is of concern. It's the highest number ever who are in need of support, protection, identification, of even naming, as the previous speaker mentioned, the importance of having an identity. Some of these people don't even have that. So that's a challenge. We could also say the complexity of movements. We see instances in which challenges related to the environment or the political context overlap with challenges related to minority groups and to access to services and rights and entitlements. And these complexities, when they overlap, create greater numbers on the move, create greater challenges for those persons while they're on the move, and bring even higher concern when it comes to resolving the root cause of their displacement. So we see people in protracted displacement. The average time for a refugee child to be in displacement is 17 years. That's the entire childhood gone. The children are our future. So how do we believe that we will reconstruct and rebuild and reconcile Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, so many places around the world, when the children who would be the adults at that point needing to do it have not necessarily been empowered, received education, received a name and an identity. But I would say the most difficult challenge, and it was alluded to by both speakers, and certainly of concern to His Holiness Pope Francis himself, is the partnership, the solidarity, the unity that was described, that despite all of these challenges, we can have a collective response that works, but only if we collectively believe it. So we are very hopeful that going forward to the Global Compact on Refugees, the New York Declaration already adopted, and several other frameworks and instruments, that we will see this solidarity. We cannot rely on the hospitality of some without the hospitality of others. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is going to be a recurring theme throughout your meeting. I'd like to ask Ms. Klein Solomon basically the same question. For your agency, what are the most difficult and pressing issues at this time?
Thank you, Cindy. And let me start by thanking most sincerely ICMC for the opportunity to be with you today, to address you at this moment, which is very much a critical moment in the migration field. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, your team. And I want to pay tribute, since this is the first time I'm speaking, as well to your former, I don't know what he was called, your Secretary General, Peter Sutherland, who is no longer with us and who was a tremendous asset in the field and a good friend. And I just wanted to take a moment to honor Peter's life and his contribution. Thank you. Coming to your questions, and I have to say I too was very touched by the opening presentations, and I'm going to say things that overlap with a lot of what Dr. Rowland said and what my colleague Carol just said. From the migration perspective, I think the single greatest challenge is actually the rise of populism and the demonization of migrants and refugees, and this discourse that is so damaging and blaming of individuals, labeling of individuals as criminals, as threats, as terrorists, as coming to societies to try to take social services or take away jobs. This overwhelm, there's a flood, there's a tide, there's an inundation of people. These are very damaging terms, as is the term, of course, labeling any individual illegal. A person can't be illegal. We fight very hard to not use the term illegal migrant, and certainly illegal alien is even worse. But to really talk about migrants in an irregular situation who may not have entered according to with proper documentation or may have overstayed their proper authorization. But that demonization and that framing is so destructive. And then related to that, a very clear related challenge is to try to have a more evidence-based, more accurate narrative about migrants and migration. And Carol talked about the 66 million forcibly displaced in the world today, both as refugees or internally within their own countries. UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs came out recently with the figure of 258 million international migrants today, according to census data. By all accounts, that's an underestimate, but very importantly, those 258 million people include the majority of the people that are in this room today and who are not in need of special protections or outreach or concern by the international community. And I say that in saying that we should not view those large numbers of migrants, which are higher than there have been in historical history, but it's still only 3.4% of global population, and overwhelmingly, most migration takes place today as a matter of choice, through safe and legal channels, and is of fundamental benefit not only to the individuals and their families, but also to the communities that they come to, and to their communities at home to whom they send remittances, transfer knowledge, skills, investment. So I'm not suggesting that migration is always positive. We have to recognize that there are migrants who are not refugees according to international legal standards, who are nonetheless compelled to leave their countries of origin. And here, what I'm thinking is everything from extreme poverty to environmental degradation, climate change, violence, violations of human rights, at a level that's not, unfortunately, recognized as entitling someone to international refugee protection. And there are clearly people whose rights are violated en route, and the most visible, of course, by smugglers and traffickers who have really wrought enormous havoc in the lives of individuals. And of course, here in Europe, we saw the tremendous loss of life, particularly in 2015, but that was not an isolated instance. And then the third challenge, and this will be the last one I offer, but it's very much related to those, is to really frame a discourse and an understanding of migration that recognizes that migration is fundamentally a natural phenomenon, and people seeking to improve their lives and the lives of their families are not criminal. They are not evil with intent, but simply doing what you and I would do if to protect the well-being of our families and to open up a more balanced discourse, and therefore the possibility of having policies that are not framed from a criminal enforcement perspective as the principal outlook, but are framed first and foremost from the perspective of the individual at the center, and then picking up very much on what Carol and Dr. Rowland said from a genuine perspective of solidarity, really seeing that the human condition is ultimately what we're looking at in migration, and we need to work together to manage migration in a humane way that respects the dignity, the lives, and values the human being at the center. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What you said about moving away from enforcement and protection only kind of reminded me of a conversation I had last week with a sister who's involved in on the Texas-American border, and she said that like one of the phrases that's being used nowadays is catch and release, which is something we use when we talk about fishing. I mean, yeah, it just kind of freaked me out. But thank you. So Walter Brill, basically the same question to you, but look, after just having watched this video where resettlement, particularly in the United States, was such a big historic part of the ICMC's work, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difficult and pressing issues today for ICMC and where those policies fit into the current political climate, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Let me first say I feel really honored to be in that panel, especially with Carol and Michele, who I've known and appreciated for quite some time. We used to be also colleagues at some point. And this is already my third ICMC Council meeting, so I almost feel like a veteran. Let me say, unfortunately there is no shortage of challenges. And I guess we all had the difficulty, which one do we mention? Where do I start with in 2 minutes? I could talk about Syria. Carol just mentioned the projected situation. There's no solution inside, and we still have, millions of Syrians displaced in the neighboring countries. I could talk about the Rohingyas and their flight to Bangladesh. Again, currently an extremely difficult situation. I could talk about South Sudan with more than 7 million displaced persons. And ICMC in some of these operations is acting directly, where we have our own programs, such as in Jordan and Syria. And in other situations, we have our members who respond. I mentioned the Rohingya situation, where, for instance, Caritas Bangladesh who is very much in the forefront on the response on the ground. So they also, just to say, ICMC is a network. Some things ICMC we do ourselves operationally, and other things are done by our members. But now let me come to your question about resettlement. And resettlement is something that is part of ICMC's history. You have seen the video earlier. ICMC brought people to Latin America, IDPs after the Second World War. We helped with the resettlement of the Vietnamese. And we've been for decades involved in the resettlement to the United States. And on average, we would resettle about 7,000 people every year. Now, for about the last year now, unfortunately, this resettlement has almost come to a standstill. Between, we calculate in fiscal years, so with the start of the fiscal year in October 2017 until the end of February, we had roughly 100 people who departed. And you see that again in perspective to the 7,000 that we managed to move in the past. And, talking about numbers is not enough here. And I want to briefly mention a concrete case so that you can associate what we are talking about. I asked the colleagues, send me a case, where currently, somebody who's waiting for departure. We have a Sudanese Christian. He's 31 years old, has a wife and a daughter 2 years old. Basically, in Sudan, he was a slave laborer on a farm. He was beaten for years. Then he managed to escape at some point. He went to Syria. In Syria, he found a job at a gas station, but somebody confiscated his passport. Then when the war broke out in Syria, he went to Lebanon. Then in Lebanon, he went to UNHCR, he was interviewed, he was referred to resettlement, and he was recognized both by UNHCR and then in the US procedure. But then with the Trump administration, things changed. And he has been now waiting for over 5 years for his departure. He was taken into detention because he didn't have his passport. UNHCR then succeeded in negotiating his release. But this release was conditional on the fact that the resettlement will take place. And now we had all these new decrees and new vetting procedure, and so far he could still not return. And he's faced with the threat of refoulement back to Sudan, where he risks his life. So these are the cases we are talking about very, very concretely. Now, solidarity has been mentioned. I think it is not sufficient to complain regarding the situation resettlement to the US. We have to look at other states. We have to appeal to other countries to do more. Our colleagues from ICMC Europe, for instance, are very much engaged with advocacy, again, in cooperation with others, with IOM and UNHCR, to advocate also for more resettlement places to Europe. We hope that this will happen, but it's not sufficient. So I just want to remind everyone of this very concrete situation and these people who are becoming desperate, who are asking us questions. And, Dr. Rollins this morning referred to these two groups that, from the Bible there. We, for the moment, try to keep them in this good group that is hopeful towards their future, that looks at it and believes that, I think Dr. Rollins called it sort of that the good will be the outcome. But we have some we may lose along that way, and they may end up in this other group. So we have to collectively work hard to keep them in a good group and keep that hope alive.
So, given all of this, I think my next question is the 66 million person question. I was struck by how easily the term refusal to welcome rolled off the tongue of Cardinal Parolin, who, English isn't his first language, and yet that phrase seemed very familiar to him, which, yeah. So do you have, I guess, I don't know if this question is just too big and too theoretical, but why do you think it is so difficult to convince people that accepting and welcoming migrants and refugees is good for their community, good for their nation, and good for their economy? So we start with you, since you're nodding.
I'm nodding because I scratch my head about that all the time. I don't think it's easy to answer that, but what I do feel is that we're at a particular moment in history and in development where, we know this historically, that the other is often feared. The other, whether the other comes in the form of a different color, a different religion, a different language, a different part of the world, is the human instinct is to fear. And of course, the role of responsible leadership is to teach people to overcome that and to see the other as an asset, not as a threat. And that's what really good governance is about, is to overcome that. But what I fear we've gotten into now is that we're at a stage globally, and then we see it played out in so many individual countries that have historically welcomed newcomers, like the United States, like Italy with the elections in the last few days, so many other places, where migrants and refugees have become the scapegoats in many respects. And I think for the forces of globalization, that in many ways, and I'll just speak from the migration perspective, there's an enormous amount of fear in many societies about the loss of jobs and the loss of identity, and the growing polarization between the haves and the have-nots. Inequalities are not improving in so many societies. And in many ways, the migrant or the refugee, the other, becomes the scapegoat for those ills and is seen as the one taking the jobs or threatening the identity and the stability of society, where I feel that is terribly misplaced. I mean, in many ways, it's mechanization, it's global supply chains, it's global economic integration, which has produced development benefits for hundreds of millions of people, but not everyone. And those for whom they feel that their individual circumstances are not improving, they're looking for someone or something to blame. And globalization is too abstract a notion. It's a lot easier to blame someone who looks different, speaks differently from you. And I think that it's very hard to really reframe that discourse to say, no, the statistics are incredible. We've launched research with McKinsey Global Institute, with the Economist Intelligence Unit, that really shows that overwhelmingly migrants contribute more than they take in social services. Rather than displacing workers, they create jobs. Yes, there's individual communities where there's temporary adjustments and temporary displacements of the local community. But in the longer term, the evidence is overwhelmingly that migrants actually tend to be some of the most innovative, entrepreneurial people in societies who genuinely create jobs. So, but publics don't respond for some reason to that rational analysis, and very opportunist political leaders are exploiting the fears and utilizing that in public discourse in a way that is frankly shameful and shocking and, to my mind, inconsistent with our values as human beings and where we should be in the 21st century. And I think that's really the challenge.
Thank you. Well, I wonder if it is so hard. And I say that after some decades of time working on this issue. It's hard when we speak in the abstract. It's hard when we talk about groups and massive numbers. It's hard when there's propaganda and misinformation and notions thrown out that aren't supported by facts and data and hard analysis. I was very heartened listening to a program on the television yesterday with an actual analysis of hard data. One hears that so rarely these days. Facts are not very much cherished. But in this analysis, the speaker said, dispelled the notion that it was the other, that it was the refugees or the migrants or people coming in. This particular analysis was about the United States. The interviewer gave a number of incidents, security incidents that have taken place in the United States in the course of 2017. They were all by United States nationals, citizens of the country. And so I think and I go back to the earlier speaker, we as civil society members, we as individuals really need to represent evidence, data, facts, the voice of the 66 million on the move forcibly, the voice of the numbers that Michele mentioned, much greater numbers of people on the move for a variety of reasons. We need to give them space to have their voice heard. Let them represent their own facts. Again, as the earlier speaker mentioned, she went and she talked to refugees in detention. And she got very clearly and very directly what their experience and circumstance was. In my years of doing this work, it's, as Walter was saying, both sides of the coin, but there are plenty of people and institutions and agencies and now cities and municipalities and even in the private sector who are very interested in helping, who are very interested in supporting, who are advocating with their governments to change their perceptions, to change the laws and the opportunities in a positive direction, to be more inclusive, to be non-discriminatory. There are many who are very concerned about some of the slips we see backwards with literal and figurative wall building to keep out the other. So that voice is there, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to express our concern about how some who for short-term gains, we can, perhaps this is a bit simplistic, but governments are elected. And they're elected for a period. Most governments elect, and the other ones, this is not relevant. They're elected for a period. And we have seen play out since 2015 with the significant numbers on the move that in the election process, it's very easy gains to talk about the other, the migration, the one who's coming to take what you have. And of course, who wouldn't be afraid of that? This is a human reaction and instinct, but it's not true. So we need to really dispel some of the misinformation that's being propagated against all of us.
Can I ask you basically to comment on the same thing, but I was wondering, has the Share the Journey campaign had some kind of impact yet? Is that something the ICMC is involved in to overcome that fear by actually helping people encounter one another? And touching on something, was it Anna said or the Cardinal? You're so alike, that young people are bucking this trend of fear. Are you seeing that at all in what you're doing at the ICMC?
Yes, Cindy, I think we do. I think it is not an easy message sometimes. We have also to recognize, especially when we look at the community level, I think we have to be honest also, sometimes for communities there are real problems. And we have to be honest about it, and perhaps sometimes in the past we weren't always maybe frank enough about it. I mean, we know from the resettlement procedure, again, for instance, when the refugees arrive in the United States, you know, we work very closely with the colleagues from the US Bishops' Conference, who's the biggest service provider for refugees that arrive. But of course, sometimes when you have small communities and you have refugees arriving, some of them may have medical conditions. In some places, maybe there aren't jobs around. It is also a challenge for the communities, and we have to help and assist communities in preparing for that. Our colleagues from ICMC Europe have been very much promoting a campaign working with cities where you know, mayors and others exchange experiences in Europe and tell each other also honestly about the difficulties to find the housing. And there sometimes, unfortunately, the politicians leave them alone. I've followed now a very difficult dispute in Germany where you have a food bank called the Tafel. They recently declared that for the time being they will continue to receive only Germans because they felt overwhelmed by the number of refugees and migrants seeking help. And of course there was rightly sort of a public outcry, but that is not enough. One needs to look at then the problem, and can this food bank have more resources so that they continue to serve both refugees, migrants and citizens. So my message here is just, I think it's always good to point out, yes, refugees are and migrants are a source of innovation. In the long run, economies will benefit from it. There's no doubt about it. But there can be periods where it's difficult, especially at the local community level. And this is where everyone, you know, in the Caritas, you know, for instance, the local ones, they play a very important role. The Diakonie, the Red Cross, and in similar in other countries. So there we need to provide the help, but we also need the state then to provide more resources.
Let's turn our attention a little bit now to the global compacts. I'd like to ask Ms. Klein-Solomon, what do you hope for the global compact on migration? And are there specific commitments that you hope for that may be in jeopardy of exclusion that the people in this room can kind of do a bit of lobbying for to help support?
Thank you. So as you know, most of you know, the member states of the UN are now in the process of negotiating for the first time a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. This one, in contrast to the refugee compact, is very much state-led and is now in the crucial intergovernmental negotiation phase. The first set of negotiations took place the week before last, and the next set will take place next week. The goal is to come up with an agreed consensus by the middle of July, and then to have that adopted formally at a head of state and government conference to take place in Morocco in December. You probably are aware that the United States withdrew from participation back in December, and that even some governments that are participating, one in particular, Hungary, expressed some very negative views at the first round of negotiations. I say this because we have to be realistic, and at the same time, let me underscore that IOM believes very firmly that the Global Compact for Migration presents a truly historic opportunity, a generational opportunity that we will not have again in most of our lives. This is the first time that in the context of the United Nations, member states are looking to develop a comprehensive framework on migration, a cooperation framework on migration that puts people at the center, recognizes their rights and their needs, and also, very importantly, recognizes that states still retain the sovereign discretion to determine which non-nationals may enter and stay in their territories, but that they should do that on the basis of a non-discriminatory approach. And most importantly, that they need to cooperate between governments at the regional and global levels, but equally importantly, with non-governmental stakeholders, with all the types of civil society that play such an important role in the lives of migrants, whether as service providers or advocates, and with private sector as employers and recruiters, academia. Walter mentioned just a moment ago local officials, absolutely essential in the migration area. Many of you will be aware that even governments that take a very restrictive view of migration at the national level, there are individual cities, individual municipalities that are taking a much more inclusive view. So my hope, our hope, is that first of all, that we come out with a document that is very forward-leaning, recognizing that migration is overwhelmingly a positive force and recognizing the humanity that underpins it. And that secondly, that it keeps a process of dialogue and consultation and progress going, and that take place not just at the global level, but really translate down to the regional, national, and sub-regional levels, where it really matters, where those encounters between migrants and host communities take place. So the document itself matters, and its outlook, framing of migration in a positive way overall, while recognizing challenges, framing it in a people-centered way that really recognizes the human being at the center, but framing it as a cooperation mechanism. That matters. But equally important is the process and retaining, and I hope, growing an inclusive sense of ownership at all levels, that this phenomenon of migration is not going away and can be beneficial if we actually engage in preparing it and managing it. And I'm struck very much by what Walter just said. I mean, that's our message, that migration can be managed to be beneficial, but it requires an attitude change, and it requires investment at all levels to plan and manage. And that will take time, and we should not see this as a one-off, but see this as a longer-term project and one that's based on solidarity. Again, I cannot underscore that more. Last point is that part of the reason that I think this is such an opportunity is that most countries today are both countries of origin, transit, and destination of migrants, not simply a country of destination, not simply a country of origin. And that allows states to recognize each other's challenges, see themselves as in this together, and that they need to work together. And equally, that it's not just states who manage migration, that we need to bring in all the non-governmental stakeholders that play such a crucial role. Thank you.
Can I ask you to talk about the Global Compact on refugees? And is there something particularly different, hopefully easier, to get that done, given the international recognition of and protections, I hope, for refugees?
Well, actually, I think you're right, Cindy. As Michele was describing, this is the first time in which member states of the United Nations and different partners have come together to see what could be done with regard to migration. Of course, when it comes to refugees, there are many frameworks in place. The 1951 Refugee Convention, its protocol, we could go down quite a lengthy list. The New York Declaration that was adopted the year before last, and its manifestation in the Comprehensive Response Framework for Refugees. This is already a framework for taking those principles forward. And I think when it comes to the Global Compact for refugees, we are at a phase where the implementation, the operationalization is the critical thing, because we see many states hosting huge numbers of refugees in the millions generation after generation. And those countries are increasingly coming forward to say, well, where is the solidarity? Is this an international commitment, or is this just something that a state is compelled to do because of their geographical location? How is it that the lifespan, a typical lifespan for a refugee is 17 years? That's not a message of unity, solidarity, and solutions orientation. And it sort of sends the message that, one should be very mindful of letting people in the first place, because when will they leave? So we really need the principle that we have seen in so many faiths, and we heard again this morning, this emanates from the Christian tradition. Safety, security, hospitality, and this is felt in many traditions around the world. Now it's found its articulation in legal frameworks, development by governments, but we see a trend that is going in the reverse. It will not be possible 5, 10, 20 years down the road, after we've had these discussions, as Michele has said, this is a moment in time. If in this moment, when we all come together and we're looking for that solidarity, we don't find it, we will see reverse trends of, if there's no hospitality there, then there's no hospitality here either, and the very heart, the very principles will be challenged. I'd say we'd also like to see a reduction in this securitized interpretation of international protection. It goes to so much of what we've all said earlier. And I think one critical way in which this can be done is the inclusion of youth. You know, I saw a study recently that analyzed how some youth were recruited, if you like, into some of the organizations around the world today that we refer to as terrorist organizations. And what this study found was that their first point of disenfranchisement was within their own society, with their own institutions, with their own systems of governance. They felt they did not have a voice. It made them very, very easy prey for those who would like to draw them into another direction. In the preparations for the Global Compact on Refugees, we've included refugee youth as delegates. They sit on the panels with us. They sit in the negotiations with us. They can say what their hopes and dreams and aspirations are. Refugee girls can say the challenges they have with regard to education or sexual violence, and refugee boys can talk about challenges that they are facing in terms of securing a future for themselves. We need to empower, not talk about, but talk with those that these compacts would cover, and empower them to be their own voice. I think this will very much help in ensuring a holistic response. Thank you.
So, Walter, for both of these compacts have been treated as very separate things in separate cities and separate meetings. I understand that there is some concern that such a clear distinction between migrant and refugee, between the two compacts, could leave what you all refer to as protection gaps, for example, for rejected asylum seekers, for migrants with special vulnerabilities. What do you see as paths to kind of overcome those gaps, or to protect the people who may not be explicitly number one in your mind in either one of those compacts?
Let me first start by saying that I think in ICMC we've been very lucky, because Pope Pius XII and the people who contributed to the creation of ICMC, they had the foresight to give ICMC the mandate to work with both refugees and migrants. The term mixed migration didn't exist at the time, but the people who were brought in the beginnings in the 50s to Latin America, they were exactly that. There were displaced persons from the Second World War, especially from the East, and there were migrant workers from Italy and Yugoslavia. So we dealt from the beginning with mixed migration movements. So this is a reality nowadays. You look at those who are crossing the boats in the Mediterranean, you find Syrian refugees on the boat, you find them together with people from West Africa, some of which may also have protection needs, but of a different nature, some who left the country because of poverty. That is the reality we are facing. It's the same in Libya, where everyone is trying to help those who are detained there, and you find detained, migrant workers as much as refugees. So, as ICMC, we are indeed a bit concerned that if these two processes remain totally separate, there could be a gap. For us, there needs to be some kind of a complementarity. I have this image in my head. You have a boat arrival on the beach, and then you have standing someone from IOM there with a sign that says, "Migration Compact, people, please follow me." And then we have someone else, Carol, perhaps standing there and saying, "Refugee Compact, refugees, follow me." And over the head of the people in the boat, there's a big question mark. So that is what we have to look at. One of my former colleagues, many of you know, John Bingham, who left a few weeks ago, he called, we need to do a demixing. When these people arrive at the boat, we need to demix them and see that everyone is taken care of. So that is the challenge, and I'm conscious there are many stakeholders that do not want a formal link between those two compacts, including on the government side. But I think in practice, if we look at and in practice, there are hopeful signs that this can work. The two agencies work very well, often together on the ground. With arrivals in Lampedusa, for instance, IOM and UNHCR work closely together. I know the example in Libya many years ago in the Libyan war. You had the outflow, again, very different profiles of people. ICMC was also there with our deployees that looked at resettlement. IOM and UNHCR worked together. So we have good examples, and our hope is that when it comes to the implementation of these compacts, that there really everyone will look at the complementarity, including through the actions of these agencies, and that then nobody will be left behind and be taken care of within the different protection regimes. We have a clear protection regime for refugees. I think that should not be undermined. That will hopefully all stay in place. But there are then different degrees of needs for the others, and we need to ensure that those will also be looked at.
Ms. Klein, Solomon wanted to answer or add something?
Yes, just very briefly, and I wanted to touch on precisely the example that Walter gave, the Lampedusa example. And there used to be something called the Presidium Project. Now, this was years ago, but when there were boat arrivals at Lampedusa, there were several agencies working together with the government of Italy, UNHCR, IOM, Save the Children, to make sure that children's needs and rights were taken care of, the Red Cross, IFRC, Red Crescent Movement. And there, I remember John Bingham saying, let's look at needs first, rights-based approaches. So looking at what the individual human need is, and let's not worry about if they're wearing a big R or a big M on their foreheads. People are not labeled that way. Let's attend to immediate needs on a completely non-discriminatory basis. And then, once people have had a moment to settle, recover from their journeys, then see what additional protections and different needs individuals are entitled to, and do that kind of separation for additional protections. But starting very much from the position, and I was struck by something that Dr. Rowland said this morning, that every human being has human rights. So there was some discourse at some point about good refugees, bad migrants. No, let's talk about all human beings, all have human rights, human dignity, human needs. And then there are certain people who have suffered much greater abuses or have greater vulnerabilities, and I absolutely agree with Walter, none of us want to undermine refugee protection at all. But let's start from human rights and move up, rather than from Refugee Convention and move down. Thank you.
I still have more questions on I always have more questions. But there's only 20 minutes left, so if you have questions, you can jump in. People have questions. Would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you very much. Bill Canny with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. First of all, Michele, it's very nice to see you up on the panel representing IOM. It was actually the president of ICMC some perhaps a dozen years ago who publicly advocated that IOM become a member of the United Nations and was reprimanded at the time by the Secretary General of IOM. So it's very nice to see you up and to speak sort of truth to power as now part of the United Nations. But Cindy, I actually wanted to direct this question to you, didn't want to let you off the hook. Correct other panelists. Cindy, we talked, Carol mentioned facts, and in the United States we're dealing with facts versus sort of fiction, and the newspapers have actually stepped up and do things such as fact checkers, and they give Pinocchio awards to politicians who tell certain levels of lies. And in fact, some people think that the Washington Post and the New York Times will eventually be given Nobel Peace Prizes for their current work. But my question to you is, in the Catholic newspapers and in the European newspapers, do you see this level of sort of, what I would call even resistance to the governments and the policies and the populism that we're seeing that are feeding certainly fear and contributing to this anti-refugee and migrant fervor in many different countries?
I'm always struck by any time I write about something that the Pope says about migrants or refugees or tweet about it, I get 3 or 4 likes for the Pope, basically, and 10 or 12, well, if he thinks we should open up to migrants and refugees, why doesn't he? And then you write back, he in fact did. He has, and that continues. Well, they have all that money that he should have more. I think one thing that became clear here is that individual stories of individual people are incredibly effective. People don't like migrants, but they don't have a problem with the new couple in their parish who are, kind of that they're helping to learn English. They've helped to find an apartment and furnish it. I think people are playing fast and loose with facts and figures, and it's much harder to do that when you're portraying the life and the hope and the story of an individual person, and we can all relate to those individuals on some level. I just don't know if it's working, though. I mean, I'm amazed at kind of how people just kind of, some politicians go merrily along repeating the same old lies, and I just don't know. I mean, I think journalists use those fact checker things, but I don't know. I'm sorry, Bill, I just don't know. Does anybody else?
I would like to say something on that too. I agree with you, Carol, that getting out of the macro and into individual stories is one of the key things, and actually having individual interactions make a difference. I mean, you think back on the Brexit vote in the UK in 2016, and if you look at that, turned largely on migration issues. And if you look at where the vote was to leave, it was primarily in communities that had next to no migrants. And actually the communities that did have significant immigrant or foreign populations voted to stay. And I think when it's no longer just this abstract idea, this abstract threat, but as you say, the people who are in your parish. So some of the things that we're trying to do, and I know, and we just need to all multiply this. We have a campaign called I Am a Migrant that actually we picked up from a civil society organization in the UK, and are trying to spread that around the world, but to really have debunking these stereotypes and myths and really look at the individuals in all their complexity, because their non-native status is just one aspect of their identity. They're also a school teacher or a fabulous jazz pianist, and also, but they get reduced to this one aspect of identity that then becomes the defining one, when of course people are much more complex than that. And if you can actually create spaces of interaction, and I want to come back to that city level that Walter mentioned. I was really heartened last November. There's a city in Belgium called Mechelen, just outside of Brussels, that has more than 120 nationalities in a city of only 80,000 people. And the mayor, years ago, decided he was going to invest in creating inclusion and interaction. And he set up spaces for interaction between locals and immigrants and refugees at all different levels. And he was able to shift that perception from fear to one of welcoming, from one of seeing newcomers as a threat to see them as bringing richness, vibrancy, and something positive. It's possible to do. It's just, it really has to happen community by community, local contact to local contact, and it takes a lot of time and investment, but it's possible.
Yes, thank you. You know, I think I'd just like to make reference to the work of ICMC in this regard, because ICMC has been our longest running partner on resettlement. For just one example, we have many partnerships, deployments, advocacy, etc. And in that resettlement process, it actually starts before the person arrives in their country of destination. There are discussions that we have with typically it's a refugee. There are discussions that ICMC has, IOMs usually involved in the process of moving the person from one location to another. And then the person is received into a community. And this partnership allows us collectively to not only hear the story of the person, why did they move, what was their circumstance, very often, why can they never return to their country of origin? Why are they proposed for resettlement? What are their hopes and dreams and aspirations? And all of that potential and forward-looking possibility is being offered to the country to which they are going with incredible enthusiasm. So these stories we're engaged with every day, and I think the work of agencies like ICMC is absolutely fundamental to the unity and the partnership and the solidarity that we are so striving after. I'd also just on Walter's image of the boat arriving and the person wondering, do I go in this line or that line? I think that's a very good description of the problem right there. It is not the person's problem. That's why UNHCR exists. That's why IOM exists. That's why agency exists, so that they don't have to figure out their problem. We can help them figure it out, and we can ensure that whatever response there is to them, that it's the one that is best suited to them, which respects their rights and entitlements, ensures that they're not sent to some place where their life and security would be at risk. And this can only be done in partnership and collaboration. So again, this is, I think, very important for our work as we go forward.
Thank you very much. I want to appreciate what the panelist has contributed. However, I would think that we should have put another person who is missing, namely the role of prayer. Because we are Christians, and whenever things become tough and become very, very difficult, as Jesus was, prayer was very significant. And I think the messages we get from the Holy Father, it's not just political or economic, but that the presence of God has been almost wiped out among our leaders, politically and otherwise. As the theme of Lent says, the increasing of iniquity has made the love of many people cold. So I think we as Catholics, as we are handling this ICMC and others, and even the people we need to work with, because it's a complex issue, the role of prayer must be there. If the staff of ICMC, whatever, the scripture must be present. So I think, to me, we should have put a panelist there to complement what you have said as professionals or experiences, to tell us what is the role of prayer as we journey with the problems of migration. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think I was just kind of drawing on the morning we're building up, but I'm hoping that prayer is there, and I think actually from a lot that we've heard this morning, you can be certain that it is a strong motivator and a strong presence. Please.
Good morning, I'm Father Carlos Caetano. I'm a migrant myself. I'm a Portuguese working in France at the Bishops' Conference of France. I'm the director of the Service National de la Pastorat des Migrants. The migrants, migrantes of the French, something like that. I was really glad to see that we were consecrating a bit of time today to discuss the Global Compacts, because since September we have in France at the Bishops' Conference consecrated a lot of time to read and study and reflect, especially the document of Pope Francis with the 20 points of action that were proposed. And so we try to respond to the invitation of Pope Francis. In the beginning of January, the Bishops' Conference of France published a document where we try to, in the spirit of the first 20 points document that was distributed worldwide, we try to incarnate that document to the context that we are living in France. I'm happy to share that document with all of you. It's called Migration, trouver une réponse commune. And the document was done following this logic. We were trying to enter in this rather ambitious project of advocacy between a lot of bishop conferences, a lot of institutions, but we were also trying to keep it really simple. It's just a 4-page document because we realize we have the impression that, at least in France, there is a very big gap between the type of values that the bishops and Pope Francis and the conferences are trying to promote, and then what we are going to find in the local communities. So the document that we try to write also has a pastoral objective. In fact, we had received from the Pope 2 documents, a pastoral version and also a more political version. So that idea was already in the initial project of Pope Francis. And I was wondering if in your own efforts to influence this negotiation towards the 2 global compacts, if you have also a strategy of communication to try to not just keep at this level of the governments, of the big institutions, but also if there is a communication strategy to try to pass this type of message, this type of values to a more, how do you say that in English, a more broader public? That makes sense in English? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit rusty, so sorry. But yeah, I would like to know, because we would really want to be a part of that as well. Not just stay at the level of the big documents for the nations, but also to enter in a communication strategy that is going to hopefully change the heart of many peoples that nowadays are not welcome to this type of message of opening doors to welcome migrants and refugees. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The short answer is yes. We have sought to know this has all happened in a rather swift way. So I think both for my colleague from IOM and certainly for UNHCR, meetings were convened very, very quickly in order to meet the deadline for presentation of the compacts this year. Last year we had informal consultations, which included certainly states and government institutions, but also NGOs, civil society, as I mentioned, refugees, stateless persons directly impacted by whatever decisions are taken, academia, persons who have been involved in medical services, people who received people as they came off boats, even within government. There are many categories. There are those who are responsible for managing migration. There are those that are responsible at the local level for management of whoever happens to live in a certain area, ensuring access to services and so on. So we've tried to make the consultations very broad. This year we have commenced now with the formal consultations, and it's not so many months left before the compact in draft form needs to be presented to the General Assembly. But we very much welcome any voice. Very often, we think that things need to happen in massive numbers, but it takes one person, one event. You may remember in September of 2015, that image that will never leave any of our minds of little Aylin Kurdi's body that washed up on the Turkish shore. We had been appealing and pleading and advocating for more resettlement slots, for more managed movements of persons, and that night we finally started getting calls from states wanting to increase sharply the number of resettlement places they would give to Syrian refugees in particular. Why did they call us that night? Because their own citizens called them. Their civil society called them and said, why are we living in a world where it's possible for a little boy to lose his life in this way? What are you doing? We want to help. So any and all advocacy is very welcome.
Thank you for that those comments, and I would like to address both of them at the same time, actually. To our colleague who talked about the importance of the role of prayer, obviously we're not an ecumenical-based organization, but I'm reminded that Pope Francis, in addition to all of his extraordinary public statements about refugees and migrants and real moral leadership, he provided a specific video for the stock taking for the preparation of the Global Compact for Migration as the very opening volley in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico in December of last year. There was a statement from the Pope, and I believe that we were all touched and inspired about the message about our common humanity, and all there, no matter what their religion or lack thereof, were moved by his plea to and his moral leadership globally. So please don't underestimate the impact of that and the possibilities. ICMC, I would like to congratulate you. I think you do an extraordinary job at multiple levels around the world, at the actual operational level, working directly with migrants and refugees, at the advocacy level, certainly in the migration area it was referred to earlier. The role that ICMC has played is extraordinary in mobilizing civil society on migration-related issues and becoming the place, the convener to bring all kinds of civil society groups together and to advocate. And that document, sir, that you referred to, the one that was put out last September, October, we disseminate that all the time. And I would encourage you to do the same, and I believe that your voices can very much be heard with a couple of simple messages. And this is not necessarily getting into the ins and outs of the language of the intergovernmental negotiations. Let them do that. But to advocate for certain principles, certain basic standards, certain basic things that you would like to see, and I think very well articulated in that 20-point document, that can be disseminated and utilized across the board. And I encourage you to do so and look forward to supporting you however we can. Thank you.
I feel like I have to give Walter 1 second at least.
Thank you, Cindy. I'll be brief. No, thank you very much for mentioning the 20 points of action document. I mean, it really is an excellent document that I know serves as a guidance to many. I think ICMC had some input to it, but it's really the Dicastery for Migration and Refugees, Father Czerny, Father Baggio, who are, I think, one of the principal architects of this document. And I remember a few months ago, we were actually here in Rome in a meeting with the Australian government, and Father Baggio and Czerny were there. And while maybe the Australian government right now is not following everything, those points that are in that document, they recognize that this is really very important guidance. And I know there are many meetings taking place, I think the level of the Holy See, where this is shared with governments and governments express their appreciation. So I think I'm not the communication specialist. My colleague Juan here is from communications, our director. I think we should reflect how we can make this document even better known. And I'll take the message along and see. I know we have it on the ICMC website, but probably we can do still a bit more advocacy in distributing it.
I'd like to thank all of you for your patience I'm not a pro in this area. I think this is my first public interview that I've done. We're out of time. We're over time. It's Monsignor Vitillo's turn. I'd really like to thank the panelists for their expertise and generosity and grace and for the words that they had to say. So thank you all.